Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a question that sounds completely impossible. If pretty much every country on Earth is in debt, who exactly do they owe all that money to? I promise you, the answer is going to change how you see the entire world.
Really think about it for a second. We hear about national debt constantly. The US, Japan, Germany, China, they're all in the hole for trillions. But if all the major players owe money, who's the creditor? Who's sitting on this giant pile of IOUs?
To even begin to understand this, you have to start with this number, $315 trillion. That's the rough total of all global debt. It is a number so big, it almost breaks your brain, right? But it's also the invisible architecture holding our entire world together.
Yeah. See, debt isn't just some abstract figure on a screen. It's a tool, a really powerful one. It's the engine that's funded wars, fueled massive economic booms, and helped manage global crises. And to solve this paradox of who's owed the money, we've got to go back and see how this absolutely wild system even started.
So let's jump into Section 1. An IOU is born. We're going back more than 300 years, to a time when a king was basically flat broke.
What kicked all this off was really just an emergency measure for a war in England. But it quickly became the blueprint for a whole new kind of power. All of a sudden, a country's strength wasn't just about its gold reserves or its armies, but about its ability to borrow from its own future. It was a totally revolutionary idea, and it completely changed the game.
And this was the key to the whole thing. This brilliant little invention called the government bond. This wasn't just a simple loan. No, this was the creation of a brand new, incredibly valuable asset, the government's promise. And you could buy it, sell it, and trade it on an open market.
And this was a complete 180 in how people thought about debt. Having a huge national debt was no longer this big sign of weakness. Actually, it became a sign of a strong, stable government that people all over the world could trust with their money. The more you could borrow, the more powerful you were.
Okay, Section 2, the world owes itself. So if all these governments are printing these IOUs, who's actually buying them? Well, to figure that out, let's look at the biggest debtor on the planet, the United States.
Now this is where what we think we know hits a pretty surprising wall of reality. You might assume that foreign countries like China own most of America's debt. But nope, about 2/3 of it is actually owned by Americans. It's sitting in your pension fund, it's held by banks and insurance companies, and a big chunk is even held by the U.S. Federal Reserve itself.
And yeah, we hear a ton about the U.S. being in debt to China, but the numbers tell a very different story. Japan is actually the biggest foreign holder. In China, they hold less than 3% of the total U.S. debt. So the biggest creditor to America is, by a massive margin, America.
And this little fact points to a much bigger global truth. Japan lends to the U.S. lends to Europe. Developing countries actually lend back to the wealthier ones. So you've got countries, banks, and regular citizens all tangled up in this huge planet-wide game of passing promises to each other.
All right, Section 3, the unrepayable subscription. This is where the story gets really mind-bending. We're about to hit on a fundamental truth about national debt that almost nobody talks about.
Just let that sink in for a minute. Governments don't actually plan on paying off their debt, not in the way you or I would. And this isn't some backroom conspiracy. This is the official, stated policy. They have zero intention of ever getting that number down to zero.
So how on earth do they get away with it? Well, they treat debt like it's a permanent subscription service. When a bill for an old bond is about to come due, they just issue a new bond, and then they use that new money to pay off the old one. It's a never-ending cycle called refinancing or rolling over the debt.
And that's the absolute key difference. When you take out a loan, the whole point is to eventually be debt-free. But for a government like the U.S., the only goal is to keep making the interest payments. Why? Because for global investors, U.S. debt isn't some risky liability. No, it's backed by the biggest economy in the world, which makes a U.S. Treasury bond the safest place you can possibly park your money. It's the bedrock of the whole financial system.
So get this. The system actually depends on the debt never being paid back. If the U.S. government somehow paid off all its bonds, the global economy would lose its #1 safe asset, and the entire structure could just crumble. The debt is the heartbeat of modern capitalism.
Which brings us to our last section, the ultimate transfer. This whole thing sounds like some kind of financial, perpetual motion machine, but there has to be a cost, right? If the principal is never really repaid, who's actually carrying the weight of this permanent subscription?
And here it is. Here's the catch. The interest on all this massive permanent debt, it's paid for by you, the taxpayer.
And that money flows to the institutions, the corporations, and the wealthy individuals who own the vast majority of all those government bonds.
So over decades, this creates this huge continuous transfer of wealth from the general tax-paying public up to the asset-holding class. It is really no coincidence that we've seen global inequality rise right alongside global debt. And this entire system is balanced on one very fragile thing: confidence.
And this isn't just theory. This is what happens when that confidence disappears. For the people in Greece, it meant years of brutal austerity and lost jobs. In Argentina, a devastating cycle of defaults. For Sri Lanka, it meant total political and economic collapse. When the belief in the promise fades, the system breaks, and the consequences are devastatingly real for millions of ordinary people.
So we're left with this final, kind of chilling thought. Our modern economy has basically turned debt into money. It's a circular promise that we all make to ourselves. The creditor we were looking for at the beginning, it's just a reflection in the mirror. But a system like this only works as long as we all believe in that reflection. So the real question is, what happens if, one day, on a global scale, we stop?